Welcome to the show. We've got a guest back with us again, Dr. Michael Lynch. We had him on a little bit ago talking about hypothetical universalism and limited atonement and all that fun stuff, and had such a great time that we wanted to have him back on again, this time to talk a little more broadly about the Reformation. Dr. Lynch teaches ancient language and humanities at Delaware Valley Classical School in Newcastle, Delaware. He's also the author of John Davenant's Hypothetical Universalism, a defense of Catholic and Reformed orthodoxy. And he's also just recently edited and retranslated John Davenant's On the Death of Christ, which is available from the Davenant Institute. Michael, thanks for coming on again.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So part of why I wanted you on is because I was bummed that I wasn't able to take your class, which was titled The Reformation and Modernity, or at least that was one of the main themes in the syllabus and some of the things that were going to be talked about. And that's an interesting conversation that I've heard more and more about, especially between Roman Catholics and Protestants, with the Reformed, retrieval movement, all these types of things. People are more interested in the Reformation and really digging into what these guys were doing and what that time was all about. And I'm kind of curious because you've done a lot of work. You have a lot of thoughts on the Reformation as it relates especially to modernity. And I'm just curious what got you interested in thinking through this topic and doing research in this area.
Well, I think that most Protestants, if they're self-consciously Protestant, should be perennially asking themselves why they're Protestant as opposed to Roman Catholic, and how their choice of a religious sect is influenced by history and whether or not you're making the right choice, right? I mean, any self-conscious Mormon, any self-conscious Protestant, Roman Catholic, Muslim, whatever, has to at some point or another wrestle with the question of, are they seeking the truth, and is that truth found best in the religious kind of movement they've attached themselves to? So to my mind, it's just a simple question of, if I'm going to be Protestant, I'm going to be self-consciously Protestant, and therefore I need to have reason for being Protestant rather than whatever else.
That's interesting. I have noticed that the Protestant identity often is seen merely in distinction to Roman Catholicism. Like we're not Catholics, and there's not a sense of, okay, but what does the actual tradition look like? What's the positive kind of case for Protestantism? And I feel like today a lot of people talk about disenchantment and the ills of modernity and all those types of things. And tied into that are people drifting towards things like Eastern Orthodoxy, Roman Catholicism. They seem to have this more robust kind of, I don't know what other word, the word that people keep using, enchantment. And then part of the rhetoric is that the Reformation is part of what kind of screwed up the world. I mean, one of the things that you guys had advertised in the class was that as many great things as Protestants are credited for, freedom, prosperity, civilization, as attitudes on modernity have soured, people are turning things around and saying that Protestants are the reason for licentiousness, greed, and all the exploitation that we see around us. What's your take on that? Why is there suddenly this kind of bad take on Protestantism, or a view of Protestant that's more skeptical and even derogatory toward the Reformation?
I think people have different motivations for why they might say certain things. And motivations are always very tricky because rarely do people tell you their motivations. Instead, they say things and then you look into their background or whatever else, and then you surmise that they have an ulterior motive for saying such things, right? So it's no surprise that a Notre Dame professor would hate on Protestantism. Well, he's a Notre Dame Roman Catholic. So, I mean, this seems kind of obvious to me, right? This is a way of justifying his not being Protestant and his being Roman Catholic or whatever. It's totally fair in that sense. The question is whether or not the sorts of claims made are warranted or merit these sorts of things. And I generally find such monocausality to be somewhat ridiculous and myopic insofar as many of the problems that one finds in, say, later early modern Protestantism, you can also find in the intellectual life of Roman Catholics. For example, you have an increasing kind of materialistic, kind of philosophical kind of movement going on, which is downplaying the soul and upplaying material causality in the universe. And that's found as much in Roman Catholic philosophers, in later early modern Roman Catholic philosophers, as it is being found in Protestant philosophers, some Protestant philosophers, of course, not all. I'm just speaking generally. And so I think that there's many reasons for kind of the disenchanting of our world that aren't so much religious, but are symptoms of the sciences becoming dominant in universities, materialism, certain philosophical streams, right? I mean, Hume isn't being driven by Protestantism to kind of undermine classic Aristotelian causality or anything like that, right? And so anyways, so just the story being told, these like grand overarching stories, where a kind of religious principle, that somehow Protestants are buying too much into kind of nominalism or Scotist, philosophy and these sorts of things. I mean, you find just as many Scotist Roman Catholic philosophers as you do Reformed guys. Indeed, you find perhaps more pure Scotist guys. Anyways, in early modern Roman Catholicism. So, anyways, as someone who studies kind of Reformed Orthodox Protestantism or Lutheran Orthodox theology, I don't see a lot of disenchantizing of the world, right? All I see is Richard Baxter talking about haunted houses and believing that there's alien life forms on other planets and these sorts of things. And he's a late 17th century theologian, Protestant theologian, nonconformist theologian. I don't see him disenchantizing. Indeed, he is fighting tooth and nail against the certain rising philosophies that are materialistic and that are undermining the spiritual nature of the human being and wanting to tie all emotion and thought to some physical phenomena and cause. So anyways, as someone who just studies early modern theology and philosophy more generally, that story doesn't resonate with me at all. And I study largely 17th century theology and philosophy, and I can see some of the philosophical movements doing this, but I can't see Protestantism or even Roman Catholicism as being the cause for some of our modern malaise that we like to hate upon. Simply put, I just don't think Protestantism is to blame for there being a McDonald's on every corner or something like that, right? Like that just, to my mind, is insane. I don't understand it. It makes no sense to me.
Talk to me about Richard Baxter and aliens. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, well, Richard Baxter says given what we know about our own planet, and given the fact that we know about all these other planets, it just seems unlikely that God wouldn't populate other planets. And this is in a day and age wherein I think they only believed in 7 or 8 planets. And now we know that there's whole galaxies, right? Like not just hundreds, but I think thousands or thousands upon thousands. I don't know what modern science says now, right? So all that to say is that he was taking a very limited knowledge of how many planets there were and saying it would be insane for God not to populate those other planets. Now, as far as I understand it, we have no reason to believe that any of the planets in our galaxy are populated, but he just thought it was, he thought it was quite likely that other planets would be populated like our own. Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
Love to dig up that sermon.
I have a quote somewhere. I'd have to find it, but anyways, It's a pretty wild quote. Yeah.
Well, I think I could hear somebody saying, okay, sure, in the 17th century, there are Protestants who aren't buying into the spirit of the age, or they're not causing modernity or disenchanting the world, but there's some principle in Protestantism that inevitably leads there, whether it's the breakdown of authority, whether it's banishing the beauty of the sacraments, rampant individualism, religious liberty, all these types of things that the Reformation is, that there's something intrinsic to the Reformation.
As far as I know, the great Renaissance in music and in art was just as much, if not more so, a Protestant thing than a Roman Catholic thing. I mean, Rembrandt is not a Roman Catholic as far as I know. He was Dutch in the 17th century, late 16th, maybe early 17th century, maybe even mid. And of course, in music, right? Like, as far as I know, again, I don't know my classical music well enough, but I'm pretty confident that plenty of our famous like Bach were Protestants. So I'm not quite sure that just really holds any water. And it is true that we have great cathedrals built by Roman Catholics, but Protestants were involved in a great number of beautiful cathedrals as well. So like if we just look at art, for example, Protestants were just as involved in those sorts of projects as Roman Catholics. So anyways, that just doesn't seem to me to make much sense intuitively. But again, I don't really study art all that much, but from everything I know, from the limited knowledge that I have, that does not seem to be that you would think that you would see Roman Catholics having a particularly artistic bent in which Protestants were not. But many of our most famous painters and musicians were Protestants after the Reformation. So I'm not sure what to make of that,
Well, a lot of times there's an aesthetic draw today to Orthodoxy, to Roman Catholicism. But it's kind of like what you said in the beginning, being self-consciously Protestant, which I think above all is a doctrinal consideration. I mean, I think it's got to be about theology, not necessarily about, what kind of seems countercultural at the time, or what kind of draws in this maybe a traditional aesthetic. And I think those theological issues are still very relevant today, but they might get lost in the weeds a little bit.
I do see the Reformation as largely theological and political. There were political ramifications. There were theological ramifications. Whether or not there were these grand philosophical ramifications or not, I just don't see that as being necessarily true. Indeed, in the early modern period, I see a lot of diversity, I see as much philosophical diversity among Roman Catholics as I see among Protestants. And Protestants are picking certain Roman Catholic philosophies that they really like, and other Protestants are picking other philosophical kind of strands that they really like. And so there's an eclecticism on both sides. And I just don't see a lot of I don't see a Roman Catholic philosophy as opposed to a Protestant philosophy in the early modern period. That's completely foreign to my knowledge. But perhaps I just haven't read the right thing or something. But at least studying the 17th century, I don't see it. I haven't seen it.
We'll talk about, open that up a little bit more when you talked about there were theological but also political considerations. What sparked the Reformation? I mean, it's a large question, but what's your take on how to understand that time period?
Yeah. I'm not an expert on all the Reformations, as you know, that historians like to talk about Reformations today, because what's happening in Germany and what's happening in England and what's happening in the Netherlands and in France and wherever else, they're kind of happening at the same time, but there's not necessarily any sort of organic unity, at least at the very beginning. But I think what you have happening in Europe more generally is a breakdown of kind of this Holy Roman Empire business. You have a kind of a more localistic kind of a desire to get out of the strictures of kind of the universal jurisdiction that the Pope had over people that were living in Kent, in England, or in Leiden, in the Netherlands, or in Wittenberg, right? It's a simple matter of why is the Pope telling our German priests, German-speaking priests, our Dutch-speaking ministers, our clergy in England, what to do, and why does not our king or our prince or whatever else, why doesn't he have the right to determine who gets the right to preach in kind of our city or our town, village, or whatever else? Why does some guy, thousands of miles away get to decide these sorts of things? So there's that element to it. And then there's also this element of why are we having to fund it's not unlike the sort of MAGA American first sort of stuff that we hear today, but it's just applied to these local areas. Why are we paying for a basilica, 1,500 miles away or something, when we have poor people? I mean, you see this very early on in Luther. Indeed, his sermon on indulgences, which I highly recommend, it's better than his 95 Theses. It kind of explains. It was a defense of his 95 Theses in some ways, but his sermon on indulgences, which I believe was also published a lot more than his 95 Theses, and it was published in the same, like a few months later or something, he makes this point. He says, you can give to the Pope if you've fed all of the hungry in your city, then given to all the churches in your city, and if they don't need anything, and if there's no poor people in your town, then you start giving to, right? You see there that, so, I mean, anytime you ask why the Reformation happens, there's a whole bunch of things going on, but that's one of the things that's at the center. I mean, there's a lot, as you've noted, and obviously as anyone knows, there's also theological motivations. There's clerical abuses, right? There's all sorts of factors that are in play. But the bottom line is that I don't think you have the Reformation unless magistrates are getting on board. In other words, you're not going to have it stick unless you have magistrates who are willing to say, this is what we're going to hold to, contra Roman Catholic theology, contra Roman Catholic jurisdiction, or whatever else. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So because magistrates have the final say in the early modern period of what happens in their district, in their territory. So they bear the sword. They can shut you down. They have the army. So if you don't have magistrates on board, then it's not, you're not going to have a Reformation in that nation state or whatever, right? This is why France doesn't have a Reformation, right? This is why Italy doesn't have a Reformation. This is why France doesn't have a, did I say France already? Anyways, I didn't say France, Portugal or whatever. Anyways, but the Reformation is very appealing to many magistrates, because what the magistrate gets is some of that political power that had been granted to the Pope, being redirected and given back to the civil magistrates. So one of the things that's true in the early modern period is that the Pope basically had quasi-political jurisdiction over all of these Roman Catholic states, because he could decide that a magistrate was illegitimate because he was a heretic or whatever. And indeed, he calls King James a heretic. He calls Elizabeth a heretic, Edward a heretic, and kind of and by doing that, that was not just a theological claim, but it was also an undermining of his authority, saying that he had the power of the magistrate illegitimately. And so, Elizabeth doesn't care. She says, well, come take it from me then, right? And the Spanish Armada tried and failed. So anyways, all that to say is that when you ask what the Reformation is about, it's about a confluence of religious and political novelties that modernity is bringing in that allow the Reformation to burgeon. But I would want to emphasize that, at least on the religious side of both on the political and religious side, these murmurings, these impulses were and can be found well before the Reformation actually took root in these various locations in Europe, right? So Marsilius of Padua is saying a lot of the political, making some of the same political complaints that the reformers make later, right? And he's making that in the 15th century. And then you have, as Heiko Obermann's book, Forerunners of the Reformation, which is really just a reader of pre-Reformation texts, he notes how basically all the kind of solas, the five solas, you can find kind of those roots going again well before the Reformation in what we would just call Roman Catholic theology, right? And so some of these guys are really just continuing strands of late medieval theology. And they're just continuing to preach it. And what happens at the Reformation is that you have magistrates who are now giving them the power and keeping them from getting burned to be able to promulgate and continue teaching those sorts of things. Whereas in earlier centuries, they got burned or excised, excommunicated from the church. So
that's a fascinating survey of what was going on. And I think it's helpful because there's a little bit of a romanticized view, I think, of the Reformation. Just from hearing what you're saying, it's like you imagine it's these, guys who are going around and they're preaching and teaching and writing things, and it's just this theological movement where they're changing hearts. But there's also, dukes on their side, kings on their side, princes on their side, political intrigue, all kinds of things happening around, that the Reformation was also sort of buoyed by all these other historical events around it. It wasn't just sort of this, it's not a romanticized type of thing.
No. And it was often a dirty political game, right? And it's played on both sides because everyone agrees, whether you believe it's the Pope and kings together or you just think it's magisterial and without the Pope involved. everyone believes that the magistrate has the duty and obligation to enforce true religion. And so therefore, everyone is looking to their magistrates to enforce true religion. And so you have to have ministers and subjects convincing the magistrates that their view is the biblical view, the right view, true religion, and to enforce it. And so that's what you have going on. It's as much a top-down affair as it is a bottom-up affair. Indeed, I think at least in England, there's no doubt that England would not be a reformed church unless the magistrates enforced it from top down, right? Without King James's reforms of like getting rid of monasteries and these sorts of things like he did, which was a very dirty business, and it was very politically advantageous for him because he basically sold all that money and sold all these monasteries and took all the funds and got public land from selling all these monasteries. But what I'm saying is that it was kind of dirty business, but at the end of the day, you don't get the Reformation in England without some of that dirty business going on. And yeah, that's just.
Well, it wasn't like they were like, let's get politics involved in religion. That's just what it was. It sounds like they didn't have another concept. It wasn't like they were trying to. If they're appealing to the magistrate, they're not trying to add something new, but that's just simply what they had to do.
Oh yeah. I just tweeted this famous passage from Augustine that almost all early moderns, this goes back all the way to the early English reformers like John Jewel and others were regularly citing. Here's what it says. This is Augustine in one of his letters. He has many letters. You can find it in the published, English of Augustine. I can't remember what letter this is at the moment, but it's him commenting on Psalm 2, which is the famous song, "Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, O kings." Anyways, he says, "How then do kings serve the Lord with fear, except by forbidding and punishing with religious severity actions done against the Lord's commandments? For he serves in one way because he is a man, and he serves in another way because he is king. For because he is man, he serves him by living a life of faith. But because he is also a king, he serves him by upholding with appropriate force laws that command what is just and forbid what is unjust. In that way," and now he looks to the Old Testament kings, "in that way Hezekiah served God by destroying the groves, the temples of idols, and the high places erected contrary to the commandments of the Lord. In that way Josiah served God by also doing the same sorts of actions. In that way the king of the Ninevites served God by compelling the whole city to placate the Lord. In that way Darius served God by entrusting the smashing of the idol to the power of Daniel and by throwing Daniel's enemies to the lions. In that way Nebuchadnezzar, about whom we have already spoken, served God by forbidding with a terrifying law all those living in his kingdom to blaspheme against God. Kings then, insofar as they are kings, serve the Lord when they do these things to serve him that only kings can do." That view that Augustine just kind of lays out here, everyone in the early modern period believes.
Is he talking about the Roman emperor in that?
In Augustine's time, of course, he would be talking about the Roman emperor, right? The Christian Roman emperor, although I don't know if at that time the emperor was in fact Christian, but regardless, of course, he's talking about kings in his day, but this has been true, well, at least ever since Constantine. I'd say Paul, or I'd say the Old Testament, but regardless, this is just a presupposition that they all have and that only kings can do, right? The enforcement of true religion, as much as Tyndale might want to do that, as much as Luther may want to enforce it, he cannot, because he sees that he does not have those keys. He has the keys of the kingdom, which are spiritual in form, word and sacrament. He has the spiritual sword. He cannot enforce true religion. So to whom can he turn to ask for the city of Wittenberg or whatever to be a reformed church rather than a idolatrous Roman Catholic papal church, as he would put it, right? He would look to magistrates to enforce that.
So this goes into a larger issue of the political theology of the Reformers, and especially, so there's a phrase, two kingdoms theology, and I think the popular conception is, it's like you have your frozen chosen in church. That's one kingdom. And then you got the world out there and you just stay separate, or something like that. Like that's kind of a popular, but talk about how the Reformers understood the church's relation to the state, because a lot of criticism is that they brought in sort of, oftentimes Roman Catholics, or at least I've read them saying that the Reformation is responsible for secularism, for the removal of Christianity from the public sphere. And could you just tease out what is their theology of two kingdoms? What does that look like and mean?
Yeah, so there does seem to be quite a bit of diversity in the way that you'll find various Reformed theologians talking about these things. But as I understand it, I'm not an expert on this. I would, recommend someone like Brad Littlejohn or others who do more heavy work in kind of political theology in the early modern period. But as I understand, their kind of two kingdom or twofold kingdom theology is that God works kind of through two principles. One principle is by his Spirit through his word. And anytime a preacher gets up and administers the sacraments or preaches the word of God, he establishes, that is the establishment, that's God's ruling people's hearts via his word, and that is this spiritual kingdom. It's spiritual because it's invisible and it uses that spiritual sword. So anytime the church is exercising the word or exercising the sacraments, they are exercising and bringing about that spiritual kingdom. When you go to church and you participate in that, you are participating in the kingdom of heaven. However, God also has another kind of area or sphere or kingdom, we might say, and that kingdom is the kingdom that includes everything that's temporal, that which is not going to last, right? Marriage is a part of this, right? Because marriages aren't going to last into the kingdom of heaven, right? We won't be married, right? And so on and so forth. Everything that happens in our world that is not attached to that word and sacramental ministry that clergy are tasked with having the keys of, as it were, is part of God's earthly kingdom. And that doesn't mean that he's not interested in it, but it is not driven or it is not ruled so much by word and sacrament, but it's ruled by kings who take natural law and apply it. It's ruled by parents who bring their children up in the nurture and admonition of the world. It's nourished by various institutions in our world, governments, which are seeking to nurture the people such that it is working in tandem with that spiritual kingdom. In other words, the the earthly kingdom is specifically designed to nurture and be something like a prolegomena to the spiritual kingdom, right? Not unlike we hear that, the famous, to kind of use Thomistic language, right? Grace doesn't destroy nature, but it perfects it. So nature is like that earthly kingdom that is supposed to fit us to be prepared and ready for that spiritual kingdom that we get in the church. And so that's how it's supposed to work. They're supposed to be working in tandem, even though everyone agrees that spiritual kingdom is a higher kingdom, right?
Gotcha. So is that in distinction to a Roman Catholic conception? Do Roman Catholics have a two-kingdom idea?
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't strike me the way that I was representing it ought not to be all that. After all, I tried to tie it to kind of Thomistic ways of thinking about these things. Here's one of the concerns. The concern about how these spheres relate to each other goes back to various medieval papal bulls and papal kind of doctrines. One is by Pope Boniface. The other one is by Innocent III. And both of them conceived of the way that these two kingdoms function was that so one of the descriptions that's used is the sun-moon analogy, that the sun is the spiritual kingdom, and the moon is the earthly kingdom. And of course, if you press that too much, what you have is that the sun gives light to the moon, such that the Pope, as the vicar of Christ on earth, is the one that gives power to the earthly kingdoms of this world. And this is where you have the Protestant pushback. What they want to say is that, no, these two kingdoms are both ruled by God. They're both given power directly by God. Instead of the sun-moon illustration where God gives power to the sun and then the sun gives power to the moon. No. These are two kind of planets, both of which that God gives power to independently. So he gives power to the church. He gives power to magistrates independently. And they both exercise those kingdoms, as it were, each having received their jurisdiction independently of each other, such that kings don't give clergy power or jurisdiction. So it's not that the magistrate gives power to clergy, nor do clergy, including the Pope, does he give power to earthly magistrates. No, they're called directly by God, and they're just recognized, or consent is given to both, right? So a magistrate consents to clergy, and clergy consent to them being subject to the magistrate in his kingdom. So to answer your question, there is some kind of fundamental differences of opinion on how you understand those two kingdoms engaging each other, or relating to each other, or interacting with each other. But as I said, Marsilius of Padua, at least, seems to argue, and he's a Roman Catholic, although he's kind of seen to be a problem because of these sorts of teachings in the 15th century. He himself is arguing for these this later Protestant understanding as well. And so, and again, Innocent and Boniface aren't necessarily Augustine either, right? I mean, they're well after Augustine. And so all that to say is that, Roman Catholicism, or kind of medieval theology. I don't want to grant Roman Catholicism to all of medieval theology, but what I'm saying is that there's medieval difference as well here. There's difference of opinion, but once a pope says it, again, the question is, can the pope err? Right? For kind of medieval theologians. And well, it depends on the medieval theologian you're talking to. So, anyway.
Well, you brought up Thomism, you brought up principles of natural law in terms of how the civil magistrate is supposed to order things. And what's interesting is you spent a lot of time with the 17th century reformers. Are those the Reformed Scholastics? Is that how they're generally referred to as?
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm thinking when I talk about Reformed Scholastics, I'm talking about those that are often connected to universities, or those that are that are addressing, right? I'm not necessarily thinking about your average minister, of some local parish or something like that. Right. I'm talking about those that are doing the heavy theological work. But yeah, I mean, early modern Reformed theology, 17th century Reformed theology, more generally. Yeah.
What drew you to that generation? Because they're kind of the second and third generation after the initial reformers.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when you talk about the reformers, people just make Luther, Calvin, Zwingli the foil. Yeah. And they don't realize there's continual reform, there's continual clarification of some of those ideas that were in seed form.
Yes.
And so that's interesting that you spent some time in that sort of next generation.
Yeah, I like that generation more, or those generations more, right? You're even talking about like third, fourth, fifth generation at that point. I like those generations more for a variety of reasons. One is that the Renaissance has basically finished at this point. So you're getting the full fruit of all of these universities having taken in fully the Renaissance ad fontes sort of stuff. So that's one. So you're getting like better, you're getting guys who are educated in better sources than you had in the past, right? I also enjoy the 17th century more because of the intense interaction that you get between philosophy, theology, and the various theologians that you get. If the 16th century was eclectic, the 17th century is even more eclectic. It means you have a greater flavoring, various flavors of Protestantism interacting with each other. And then those flavors of Protestantism are interacting with various flavors of Roman Catholicism. And also, I will say as well, I find 17th century Roman Catholicism much more interesting than 16th century, because of course this is after Jesuitism, right? The rise of Jesuitism, right? The Jesuit movement doesn't start until the 16th century, right? And so post a kind of kind of a reforming of the Roman Catholic Church. This is post Council of Trent. You have a more established Roman Catholicism. Indeed, it is what I think of when I think of Roman Catholicism, is really a post-Trent Catholicism. What you have previous to Trent is just another side of of the Catholic Church, or of European religion.
But Trent is when they dig their heels in a little bit and become self-consciously this sort of...
Yeah, and I like self-conscious Roman Catholics arguing against self-conscious Protestants, rather than what you get between like Luther and say Cajetan, right? Which is two guys coming in coming from two different parts of Roman Catholicism, really. Right? They're just kind of drawing on different kind of strands of it. And when they meet and start talking, they're surprised at how different they are, right? Because they don't know, right? It's just not known that there's just so many different stripes and strands. But by the 17th century, everyone kind of knows. Everyone knows that there's different sorts of Protestants and that there's different sorts of Roman Catholics, and that Jesuits and Dominicans have their disagreements and everything like that. So
is that what you mean by the Jesuit? You mentioned how this is before the Jesuits. What was that?
So Dominicans, the Dominican tradition starts in the 13th century, right? So do the Franciscans, but those monastic traditions in the Roman Catholic Church, but the Jesuit tradition or the Society of Jesus, that tradition doesn't begin until the 16th century, right? In somewhere when it's canonized or whatever. I don't know the Roman Catholic lingo about all this.
That's fine.
But at the end of the day, right? And the Jesuits are called to be the kind of theological apologists for the Roman Catholic Church. And they're also seen to be the academics of academics. Now, the Dominicans in many ways had been playing that role, but the Jesuits become a new society within Roman Catholicism that Roman Catholics look to as being the great defenders of Roman Catholic, kind of anti-Protestant Roman Catholic theology. And so, right, it doesn't get really fun until you get the Jesuits. Protestants in the 17th century particularly have a strong hatred towards Jesuits, because Jesuits are seen to be the worst of Roman Catholicism, because oftentimes they're the most liberalizing, philosophically and otherwise, but they're also seen to often be the most hard, fiercest. They're the ones that are they play the dirtiest political and theological games of all. And so Jesuit tricks is kind of a well-known trope in the 17th century. That's Jesuit trickery, right? Is spinning biblical texts into ways to promote or to justify certain Roman Catholic readings of certain biblical texts. It's the Jesuits that are doing these things. And so, I don't know. 17th century is fun. This
sounds like a party.
It's the age of great thinkers, not just Renaissance thinkers, right? I think of the 16th century as oftentimes the age of the great kind of Renaissance thinkers like Erasmus and Louis Vives and others. But the 17th century is the great is the world of great Protestant and Roman Catholic thinking. It is the pinnacle of 17th century is the pinnacle of, in my mind, philosophy, theology, and dare I say, at least paintings and stuff like that. That type of art is some of my favorites. So that's why I'm particularly I just think they're the best educated people that we've ever had in the whole world ever. Ultimately.
Were they all Thomists?
Oh, no. This is what makes it great. You had Thomists, you had Scotists, you had alchemists, or whatever they would be called. If we're talking philosophy, right? You had materialists, you had atomists, you had Epicureans. We're just talking philosophically. Theologically, you had Lutherans and Reformed and Baptists, and you had kind of the rise of deism and other strange Hermetic philosophies and theologies. It was a wild time with just a lot of brilliant people wrestling with various ideas. So there's my love for the 17th century.
But I can also see how people would say that's where things got unspooled. That in the 18th and 19th century, you got higher criticism, German liberalism, all these types of things that are coming in.
Yeah, I mean, that starts to creep in the 17th century, but it isn't, that doesn't really creep in until even the 18th century. And what I would say to that is that the only reason we make a big deal about kind of the higher criticism stuff is because I think we are particularly because most of our theology, Protestant theology, was focused on like 19th century German higher criticism, but that sort of higher criticism is still being done in Roman Catholic circles. It's just the simple fact that you don't have a lot of Roman Catholic teachers in America in the 19th century who are, if you're a Protestant and you want to go to Europe, you're not going to Roman Catholic universities to study. You're going to Protestant universities, and those Protestant universities, unfortunately, are teaching Protestant liberalism. And so they come back and they teach Protestant liberalism. In other words, what I'm saying is that it's only because we know of the liberalism from Protestantism. Yes, liberalism was being promoted by later Protestants, but it wasn't as if there's not a lot of liberalism going on in Roman Catholicism as well. It's just that we don't know a lot about it. I mean, right? No one's going to argue with me, I think, that if you study Vatican II and much of what Vatican II represents, I know of a lot of Roman Catholics, traditional Latin Mass Roman Catholics, who think that lots of the stuff being taught at Vatican II was just straight up liberal kind of Protestant stuff anyways. And so what I'm saying is that this isn't just a problem that you found going on in in Protestantism, but liberalism was infecting the West in general, including Europe, or including European universities in Roman Catholic territories as well. And so I think it's unjust to say that just because we are very familiar with the Protestant liberalism, that somehow Roman Catholicism was immune to those sorts of things. You don't get Hans Kuhn or some of these other German Roman Catholic liberals that you find at Vatican II merely because of Protestantism.
Right. Well, what do you think are the downstream effects of the Reformation today that you can see that are positive or maybe even negative? If you could think about the lasting legacy of those 16th century, 17th century thinkers.
Once you deny papal jurisdiction, both religiously and politically, it is inevitable that nations and states and localities are going to begin diversifying, because ultimately what's going to happen is, if you're not taking your cue from a pope and the whim of a pope deciding what is truly holy and Catholic and faithful and orthodox, then ultimately you're going to have clergy and magistrates deciding those things. And once you start localizing those things, you're going to start getting diversity. And that diversity is inevitable, and differences of opinion are going to result. Now, I think it's important to realize that it's one thing for the Pope to make a claim that this is what the Roman Catholic Church believes. It's another thing to believe that people, Roman Catholics 1,000 miles or 2,000 miles away, are practicing or believing that which the Pope has claimed to be true Roman Catholic theology. I often, this is a point that Carl Trueman makes that's absolutely valid. It is one thing to look to Rome or to Notre Dame and say, this is what Roman Catholicism is. But if you take a trip to, say, Bolivia or Portugal or some of these small towns in Italy, and you go and visit and try to determine what Roman Catholicism looks like there, I think you'd often be surprised at how different it is from what Pope so-and-so says Roman Catholicism ought to be. After all you have to do is follow James Martin on Twitter to start to discern that what the Pope says Roman Catholicism teaches and what James Martin believes Roman Catholicism teaches are two different things. The difference between a Protestant church and a Roman Catholic church is the Roman Catholic Church oftentimes does very little, exercises their jurisdiction very minimally, whereas oftentimes in Roman Catholic or in Protestant circles, the exercise of discipline, whether you have a minister who's pro-LGBTQ excommunicating the Trump supporter, or you have the OPC minister who's excommunicating the lay person who's blogging about pro-LGBTQ-ness, they exercise their ecclesiastical jurisdiction in a way that the Pope and Roman Catholicism often doesn't. So while as many Protestant churches are narrow in this way in their teaching, their members are often just as narrow. But Roman Catholicism teaches oftentimes a very narrow, but their practice oftentimes permits this wide range of funny business that it's easy for a Roman Catholic theologian at Notre Dame to say, well, that's not Roman Catholicism, to which my response is, well, in practice, it seems to be. Right? James Martin, is he still a minister, clergyman in the Roman Catholic Church?
Believe so.
Yeah. So yeah, right. So if he can get away saying the sorts of things that he is, why can I not say that is Roman Catholicism? In the OPC, for example, if a minister starts saying the sorts of things that James Martin starts saying, he will very quickly not be a member of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church anymore. And so we're all going to draw lines in the sand. The question is where we're going to draw it. In the Roman Catholic Church, I'm less interested in where the Pope or what some document says. I'm more interested in what is actually permitted, because that is de facto what the church actually allows for and teaches.
Maybe to wrap things up, just summing up some of the things you talked about. I mean, if you're thinking about lay people today and this retrieval movement, that's going around with people wanting to retrieve, whether it's classical theism or, Christian Reformation theology, whatever it is. What do you think the modern church needs to retrieve from the Reformation, even beyond just that first generation, but the Reformed Scholastics that you study? What do you think are things that what are some cues we can take from them?
I don't think we'll be able to fully receive or retrieve the depths of early modern theology more generally until we've revived or reformed our educational system more generally. These are guys who were trained from 6, 7, 8 years old to be experts in the great texts of theology, philosophy, politics, medicine, whatever else. Now, of course, they're great texts on medicine we wouldn't perhaps call very great. Yeah, right. I'm not a big proponent of early modern medicine necessarily.
Yeah.
However,
take a pass on that.
It was the early modern theologians who are figuring out how blood circulates for the first time and all sorts of things. I mean, they are figuring out. This is on the cusp of kind of the scientific revolution, right? So they're learning things, no doubt. I mean, we just learned that gravity existed, right? And these sorts of things. So I'm not trying to hate. Indeed, but what I'm saying is that I don't think that early modern folk, more generally, or the early modern elite, I mean intellectual elite, were any smarter than our intellectual elite today. But I do think their educational system was better. It trained them to be able to use their skills more wisely, and and it inculcated intellectual and moral virtues in ways that our intellectual class isn't inculcated with near as much today. So I don't think you're going to get a full retrieval unless we retrieve some of the educational instincts that earlier Protestants and Roman Catholics realized in the early modern period and practiced. So one of the things that I've been a big proponent of is a re-emphasis on things like English grammar, logic, and rhetoric, right? This is the trivium in the ancient and medieval and early modern kind of educational program. But they took those things very seriously because they did not believe that their society could flourish without an educational elite. I'm not talking about an elite that's financially elite. I really am talking about an intellectual elite that was pious, that had good religious virtue, moral virtue, but was also trained in the art of grammar, in the art of logic, in the art of rhetoric, the ability to speak well, to be able to reason well, and to be able to understand language well. And I think that anyone who simply starts watching YouTube videos of the 1960s and 1970s and listens to conversations between intellectuals, even 50 years ago, will realize how bowdlerized our educational system has brought our intellectual elite today. Even listening to debates on the floor of Congress from the 60s and comparing those to the sorts of debates that we have on the floor in Congress today, it's depressing. We'll put it that way. So I don't think you can expect high-end commentary on Scripture, high-end theological imaginations without having taught people to read carefully, to argue and think clearly, and to express their ideas persuasively. And I don't think our educational system does this at all. So I think we'll just continue to see the diminution of education and of theological education in our society. And that is not a Protestant problem. That is not a Roman Catholicism problem. That is a Western problem, particularly an American problem. I actually think that there's I think some European countries still do a relatively good job at some of these things, but our educational system is atrocious.
Well, it looks like before we need to retrieve doctrines of the Reformation, we need to retrieve a whole host of other things too.
Yeah.
And but man, that really puts things in perspective. and how it's not just like you can't just read a bunch of scholastics. There's actually a whole world and intellectual formation that they had that we don't have.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who reads early modern theology or philosophy will have a very difficult time even understanding it. And one of the reasons you'll have a hard time understanding it, there's a linguistic barrier. Of course, much of it's in Latin, although that's changing somewhat, right? There's a linguistic barrier. There's a barrier with the fact that we just have not mastered the sorts of material that they had mastered. But there's also an educational barrier. In other words, they have been taught to read more carefully, to think more carefully, and to explain things more carefully than we're able to do. And therefore, it is simply the fact that these writings are just written at a higher level than most of our own intellectuals are capable of doing. Not capable naturally. I don't mean up here. I don't think they were smarter, like IQ-wise. I don't think that at all. But just trained well. I don't think they've been trained well.
Michael, thank you for joining us again. It's a great conversation. Learned a ton and had a lot of fun doing it. Appreciate what you've been doing, and we'll put some links to your books. And we appreciate you coming on and chatting with us.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's fun.